assisted dying in Oregon has worked safely and effectively for over 20 years, as you've just noted. And it really is a blueprint, so much so that 9 other US states have copied it, as well as three states now in Australia, and as of next week might be a 4th state as well, and New Zealand. They've all copied the same model from Oregon. So it's clearly a blueprint that has worked very well.
Hi, Francesca.
Hello.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on.
Well, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
I came across you guys a little while ago when I was living down in Exeter, Dignity in Dying. And I was blown away by the speaker we had come and speak to us down in Exeter. So I've really wanted to get you guys on the podcast for a few weeks now. So I'm really pleased that we've got you on. So some people will have heard of Dignity in Dying. I think I may have shared the odd thing of yours online, but I guess quite a few maybe won't have. So do you want to just talk to me a little bit about who Dignity in Dying are, first of all, and then maybe we'll discuss who set it up, when, and why?
Absolutely. So Dignity in Dying, we're a campaign group, and we're calling for the option of assisted dying for terminally ill, mentally competent adults here in the UK.
Great. So we'll come on in a minute to some of the jargon, like the difference between assisted dying, assisted suicide, and all of that in a minute. But do you want to just tell me sort of when it was set up and by who?
Yeah, absolutely. We were originally set up in 1935.
Wow. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. I should have looked
that
up.
Really. A while ago, yeah. By actually a group of volunteers, which included doctors and ministers of the church, actually.
Right. Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So British people have wanted to choose how they die for a really long time.
Yeah.
Public support remains very high. It's about 84% among all demographics to this day. So we've been known as Dignity in Dying since, I think, 2003.
Brilliant. And what were you guys named before
that? When we were set up, we were called the Voluntary Euthanasia Society. And we'll get into that later. I think the terminology has very much changed over the years, but now we firmly support assisted dying for terminally ill people.
Okay. Yeah, because I saw that I was researching you guys earlier, and you've got a similar name to the group that was set up in Oregon in America, something about Dignity in Dying there as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think they were Death with Dignity.
Yeah. But I think that word dignity is really crucial, and actually it sells as, I think that's the most important word, because obviously, and we'll come on to this in a minute as well. But for me, it's that like excruciating lack of dignity, as well as lack of choice, but that lack of dignity where you're, in your final hours, you don't feel yourself. There's so much of your physical ability gone, and that sense of dying with dignity. I think, obviously, for me, I'm only 30, so it's not something I've had to really consider too much. But when my granddad was poorly, I just remember that was one of the first times that I ever considered this sort of stuff. And I remember thinking, we were happy to put animals down, dogs when they're suffering, horses, cats, but for humans, it just seemed wrong that we would allow our animals, our pets, to die with dignity, but not our human loved ones. It just didn't seem the right way around to me. But we'll come back to that in a minute, I think. So I just wanted to ask you, obviously, you guys have been around for a long time, and you campaign a lot, and you've had obviously lots of successes. What's been your biggest success to date? And then maybe we'll ask you what the biggest challenges have been to date as well.
Yeah, this is quite a hard one to pick one event, because actually we have had a lot of successes. I mean, obviously we haven't had the biggest success yet, because then hopefully I wouldn't be here, because we would have succeeded. And certainly as a campaign group, we aim to not exist anymore. We aim to change the law, and that's our ultimate aim, which is why we're still in action. But we have had quite a few successes. I think one of the biggest really, really critical successes that we had was in 2009. there was a woman called Debbie Purdy, and we supported her with a groundbreaking case where she challenged the law. And in fact, it led to the Crown Prosecution Services issuing guidance at the time. It's actually when Keir Starmer was also Director of Public Prosecutions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Sorry, it's probably quite a lot of legal jargon, but they clarified that compassionate amateur people who assist loved ones to die should not be prosecuted, or it's not in the public interest to prosecute those cases. So that really clarified what a lot of people had been worrying about for a while, of if they traveled to another country to have an assisted death, would their loved ones face prosecution? But it didn't change the law. It simply, well, in some respects, it created a bit of a grey area, but at the time, really groundbreaking step towards a change in the law. We also then supported the Noel Conway case in 2017. Noel Conway, who's still alive, he has motor neuron disease, and he was challenging the law. And although he didn't win his case, the judges said that it was an issue of transcendent public importance and something that Parliament needed to deal with. So that was really, really important. But we've had huge successes in terms of shifting the medical profession and medical opinion in this country. Lots of the medical colleges are now neutral, so they don't actively campaign one way or the other, but they recognise the range of voices, and that includes the nurses, the physicians, and the British Medical Association did a huge survey of their membership recently. We've made huge gains in Parliament as well. We now have, we're now sort of level with our opponents in the House of Commons. We've got majority of support in the House of Lords. And very recently, the Health Secretary has commissioned data and further research into some of the problems with our current law. So that's been really, we've had some really great successes. And the media are often really on our side as well. We've had some very high profile media cases, as well as Noel Conway and Debbie Purdy, individuals like Jeff Whaley and Dennis Eccleston, who unfortunately are no longer with us, but their cases have really kind of resonated with the public and brought more politicians on side as well. But in terms of the biggest challenge, it is really kind of one challenge in a way. It's our opposition, and they are a small but very vocal minority who are against individuals having choice and having autonomy over our lives, really, not just our deaths. They're often the same people who oppose LGBT rights, who oppose abortion or drug reform, or lots of progressive social issues, which I'm sure your listeners will be in favor of. But there's a lot of the same people who oppose some of those.
So small c conservatives. Are we talking about in Parliament?
Well, they are a small but vocal minority, and they are too often part of the establishment in this country. So Parliament does unfortunately have quite a few of them, and they're often connected to the church, are not always, but often, and they found their way into the medical profession in some areas as well. So they tend to be part of the fabric and the establishment of this country, despite popular opinion and public opinion being much more the other way.
Yeah, because I saw on your website that 80% of religious people support a change in the law on assisted dying. But then Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's anti. He's an opponent of yours, but you've had two former archbishops who support your cause.
Yes, absolutely. So, faith groups and faith leaders are not, monolithically opposed to us. We have lots of individuals who've come out and shown their support, but it tends to be more those at the top who are, for whatever reason, less in favor, but ordinary people of faith, ordinary people who go to church or go to synagogue, are actually quite broadly in favor of a change in the law.
So these establishment figures are actually quite out of touch, basically. Absolutely.
Yeah. And to some extent Parliament is as well.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, you don't have to tell me about that, about how out of touch. I mean, particularly the government benches, but yeah. But I won't draw you on that, because presumably you're very you're very cross-party, aren't you, or non-partisan as a charity. So I wanted to, so on your website, obviously you've got sort of like questions, the sort of like normal questions that you get asked. And obviously I think it's important for me to just throw some of these at you, because when we had our speaker come down to talk to us in Exeter, we were just throwing them at them because we didn't really know the answers ourselves. So the first one I wanted to ask you was, what are the problems with the current law, the current laws on assisted dying at the moment, which presumably are very archaic and very unethical, presumably.
So we think the law in this country it's broken, it's unsafe, and it's unfair. Terminally ill people are presented with quite a stark set of choices at the end of life, and they also have few people that they can discuss them with. So our law, which came in, the Suicide Act, which came in 1967, it criminalizes assisting another person to end their life. Although it's perfectly legal to end your own life, it's against the law to help somebody else. But what's defined as help is also quite broad. So in fact, what it's done has really driven the practice underground and overseas, or left people with no other choice but to suffer against their wishes. So even talking about how you might help someone end their own life is also against the law.
Really?
So
wow, okay.
Provide advice on how to travel abroad.
Yeah.
You can advise someone on the way to end their own life that might be less traumatic than another way, for example. People can't talk to their doctors about assisted dying. Many doctors won't have that conversation with patients at all because they're afraid of breaking the law. So this means we've done some research on this, and actually before the pandemic, one British person a week was traveling to Switzerland for an assisted death, and this is one of the only countries where it's actually legal to they allow foreign nationals to die there. We also know that 17 dying people suffer as they die each day. So these are people who, despite having access to excellent palliative care that we have in this country, will still be in pain as they die, or have other symptoms that are really undignified, which I'll spare your listeners, and I won't go into detail, but there are many really awful symptoms, not just that people can experience when they're dying. And as a result, we know that other people try to avoid this and attempt to take their own life in this country, because many people can't afford to travel abroad. It's very expensive to go to Switzerland, and there's a lot of bureaucracy involved as well. And we think as many as 10% of suicides in this country are by people with a life-limiting illness. And this is actually what we're very pleased that the Health Secretary has noticed this and actually asked the Office of National Statistics to gather more information and data on this problem. So really banning assisted dying doesn't make the problem go away. And even with the best palliative care, and even with greater investment in palliative care, it doesn't matter. There will always be that small group of people who are small but significant proportion of dying people who will experience prolonged suffering as they die, and they want the choice to opt out of that. And I can't see why we should deny that to them.
Nor can I, if I'm being perfectly honest. I was going to quickly sneak this one in as well. I saw on your website as well, it says something, I can't remember the number now, but about the number of doctors who are putting their careers and their own freedom potentially on the line by choosing the ethical option and giving the advice, or doing something that's at the moment against the law, but would just to most of us would seem perfectly ethical. I guess we're putting doctors in a really hard position as well, aren't we, or people in the NHS?
Absolutely. And we know now that many doctors do actually support a change in the law.
Yeah.
A lot of them are really afraid of having any conversations because there hasn't really been much clarity on what they can and can't say. And often the law that we have, the ban on assisted dying, kind of shuts down some of those conversations.
Yeah.
A fear of wandering into illegal territory means that with any any conversation about it at all. Obviously, there are individuals who are willing to stick their neck out a bit, but it shouldn't be down to that luck of the draw, depending on which healthcare professional you have right in front of you. We know, for example, that some GPs have been very helpful when someone is trying to go to Switzerland, and helped with documents and even faxed documents straight from the GP's surgery. And yet we know others who straight away say, no, I can't help you at all. I'm seeking legal advice, and can be actually very obstructive the other way.
And these are people who are obviously, in terms of the patients, these are people who are already incredibly vulnerable and stressed and anxious and suffering, and to have to put them through even more suffering as a result just seems so wrong. I wanted to ask you about Oregon then, because Oregon is a sort of a blueprint for you guys, aren't they? And I wanted to ask you if the evidence from Oregon, because they brought their law in 1997, so they've been running this now as an experiment for decades. Does the evidence justify your position in terms of what we've seen from Oregon?
Absolutely, I think it does. Assisted dying in Oregon has worked safely and effectively for over 20 years, as you've just noted. And it really is a blueprint, so much so that 9 other US states have copied it, as well as 3 states now in Australia, and as of next week might be a 4th state as well, and New Zealand. They've all copied the same model from Oregon. So it's clearly a blueprint that has worked very well. And we've examined it as well. And the state of Oregon produce a report every year into the law. So there's quite a lot of data available to look at. And there have been no cases of abuse in that over 20-year period now.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worked incredibly safely, and there are really strong safeguards in place.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you next, was what are those safeguards? Because I think that's what a lot of people would be concerned about, is can this system be exploited? Are people going to lose their lives prematurely, or are people going to be forced down a road where they wouldn't necessarily have gone? What are the checks and balances?
So the key one, first of all, really is the criteria. So in Oregon, and that's what we support here, assisted dying is for someone who's already dying. They have a terminal condition. So it's not about a life ending prematurely. It's about someone who is reaching the end, who's pretty close to the end, and they want to take control over their ending. So firstly, they have to be terminally ill, and they have to be mentally competent. They have to be fully mentally aware of everything that's going on around them. So those 2 are really important safeguards anyway.
Yeah.
And on top of that, you always have to be assessed by 2 independent doctors, and they will certify that you fit that criteria, but also that you are making this decision free from any coercion. And the dying person also must take the medication themselves. That's really critical. They can be helped, but the final act must be their own, and they must consent right up until the point where they take the medication.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just curious. I mean, you're not obviously you don't obviously work in the NHS, so you may not know this, but how would they determine if somebody is mentally competent? Do you know the process involved in that?
So here in the UK, we already have mental capacity laws that operate in lots of other ways. So we have the Mental Capacity Act, which has been in place, I think, since 2005.
Okay.
So that's something that for lots of other types of healthcare professionals are used to making capacity assessments.
I see. Okay.
Lots of other areas.
Yeah.
So that wouldn't be an issue really. That's something that just apply from other areas straight into this.
I guess the other one that gets thrown around a lot is, would this lead to a slippery slope? Would it open Pandora's box? Would we be bringing in euthanasia next? Would we be going down, a sort of Netherlands and Belgium approach? What's your sort of answer to that?
Well, I'd say no. It's not. It's definitely not the case, and that's particularly going back to what I said about assisted dying being when a dying person with full mental capacity takes control of their death.
Yeah.
They request the help from a healthcare professional. They request life-ending medication, but they have to take it themselves. And I firmly believe, and the evidence suggests, that the law you bring in as a country is the law you get. And the Netherlands and Belgium have brought in laws that they believe work for their population, and that's fine. But those laws have always been different to the ones we're campaigning for. They didn't start where we are and then go broader. They always were broader in the first.
Yeah.
And in Oregon and the other US states and Australia and New Zealand, they've never expanded their laws. They've always been narrower and focusing on dying people. So they're just different. They're different issues, really, in that.
Yeah.
But also, I think in general, a slippery slope argument, I think it's quite insulting. Personally, I think it's quite insulting to our parliament, to our legal system, to say that one law inevitably leads to another. Because Parliament and the court's job to enact and enforce the law, and they need to do that to the letter. And I think it really undermines, their role to suggest that the floodgates will open.
Yeah, to be honest, I've always found the slippery slope argument quite fallacious. It really is like the last kind of argument you go to, isn't it, when you've run out? But I think that is something that people do have a kind of just intrinsic fear of, is, if we just allow the ending of life in any way, that could start to normalize the idea that life is no longer precious, and we could just really nearly start, blah, blah, blah. So I totally get what you said. And I think, like you just pointed out, Oregon have had these laws since 1997, and they've remained as they are. No one sought to come along and say, we need to up this for any reason. So yeah, that's good.
Sorry. I was just going to add that that's also really key. Nowhere where they've brought in assisted dying has ever overturned it. They've never gone back.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah. Although I guess this is a slightly off topic, but we're suddenly at a point in America now where they're talking about. I saw Texas. Was it today? They've just brought in a new law on abortion where you can't get an abortion now after 6 weeks or something, even in the case of like rape and abuse or something. So they are going backwards on some things in America, but it's good to know that on this they're not, which is pleasing because America is in a dark place in my opinion. But so I wanted to ask you then, what's the distinction between assisted dying, assisted suicide, and euthanasia? Because these are three different concepts, aren't they?
So I think I've already explained what assisted dying
is. Yeah.
Very much when a dying person is taking control.
Yeah.
Assisted suicide is similar, but it's not necessarily that the person is dying, but perhaps they've got some kind of long-term or chronic condition, so that their life, they may have lived on for many more years, but they've decided, that this is a point where they've reached enough. Euthanasia has become the term to refer to when someone ends someone else's life. So assisted suicide, the person still has to make the decision themselves and take the medication themselves. Whereas euthanasia is when someone might end. It's like when you take your dog to the vet, that is actually euthanasia. The dog doesn't say, I consent to this.
Yeah.
The vet makes the decision for them. So they are quite different, and that's why we think the language is really important.
Yeah. So I wanted to just ask you about what the situation is in the Netherlands and Belgium, because although we've literally just said that you guys wouldn't argue for additional laws to come in to match sort of Netherlands and Belgium, are you able to comment on why Belgium and Netherlands have gone like one step further and legalized assisted suicide and euthanasia?
Yeah, it's interesting. I can only presume that that's what the public there want, and also what their parliament and their government have wanted as well. So I don't know that there was any kind of necessarily any sort of different evidence or anything of like that. The Netherlands are generally quite a liberal country on many issues, as you probably know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not sure why they've always had broader laws, but I know that they've always been that way from the start. It's not been something that's come in kind of one after the other.
Yeah. And you guys are firmly of the opinion that what they have done is not what you would like to see in the UK.
We are firmly of that opinion, and that's partly because we know that's not what the British public want either. So the 84% for assisted dying is for people who are terminally ill,
Yeah.
and that public support really drops. I don't know what it's like in the Netherlands, but certainly for British people, that's not what they're asking for. So we're campaigning for what we know that the British people will support. And also the really strong, safe track record that we know has been replicated by other countries is the Oregon model. That does appear to be, on the global scale, more popular,
Yeah.
because it's safer, and the safeguards are stronger. So that's really what we're going for, is the safest and the one that has the highest public support. But there's also an element of, we know what our politicians will be willing to accept as well. And having done lots of campaigning, I can tell you for free that there are, hardly any politicians who would support Dutch or Belgian law in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, when you were just saying the numbers there, I was just thinking to myself, it must be so nice to be campaigning in a space where there's such a large consensus for your position, because having come from campaigning on Brexit, where it's literally 50-50 and it's so toxic and so divisive, I was just thinking, it must be lovely to just have 80% support, 85% support wherever you go. But yeah, so
yeah, we'll get on to that. No, it's fine. We'll get onto that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about what happened in 2014 and 2015, because in those 2 years there were two separate bills that one went through the Lords, one went through the Commons, and it looked as though we were going to actually get a new bill that brought in assisted dying. So what happened firstly in 2014 in the Lords?
So Charlie Faulkner, he had a private member's bill, and he decided to do it on assisted dying. And he actually had really high support for his bill in the House of Lords. So it passed the second reading, and it was actually starting to go to the committee stage. But because it was a private member's bill, they're not always given a priority in terms of timing and scheduling. And it actually ran out of time before the 2015 general election. So it didn't fail. It wasn't lost. It was actually on a path to victory. But when that election was called in 2015, you go back to square one. Unfortunately, that's just how the system works.
Yeah.
So then Rob Maris, when he was drawn near the top of the ballot in the Commons, he decided to take on that baton from Charlie Faulkner into the Commons. But many of the MPs were very new. So the election had happened in May, and Maris's bill was being debated in September. So there was quite a big churn that year, and there were a lot of new MPs. And they weren't really educated on the bill or the details of the bill. The discussions we've had just now about the distinction between assisted dying and assisted suicide, or what happens in Oregon or what happens in the Netherlands, they were not clued up on that at all.
Yeah.
And our opponents put a lot of effort into trying to block this, and there was a lot of scaremongering and sort of vociferous campaigning. But interesting, what you just said about public opinion, I think is also really interesting. So a lot of MPs we spoke to said they thought public opinion was more divided. They thought it was 50-50.
Really?
They often base it on what their post bag looks like.
Yeah.
And they get an equal number of letters for and against something. They often think that's what public opinion is.
Yeah.
When really our opponents had whipped up all their supporters to lobby hard at their MPs, but they only actually represent a small proportion. So it really led us to regroup and focus much more on the grassroots. And that's actually, when I joined the organisation, we really had decided to take a slightly different approach and focus a lot more on grassroots and people's personal experiences, and getting individuals who support a change in the law, encouraging and supporting them to go and talk to their MPs directly in their constituency, because that's what really has a huge impact on an MP.
Yeah. That's interesting what you said about the MPs not necessarily knowing, because they were judging it on the emails. I wonder if, obviously, I presume, well, I did see the results in the Commons, and obviously it was a big chunk of the Conservative Party. Were there any Conservatives that sort of, was it like 10% of? Do you remember in 2015?
There were some Conservatives who voted in favour, for
Yeah,
sure.
but a smallish number.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
there were, and we've gained a lot actually in the Conservative Party since then. We've gained
Okay.
a lot of supporters.
Yeah.
There weren't any. Another issue we had at the time, there weren't really any big names, big hitters, who came out in the Conservative Party, and that does have an impact on other MPs, whether
Yeah. True.
they'll be swayed. And you also get a momentum effect once MPs don't think it's going to win. They don't want to stick their neck out and vote for something that's going to lose. So
yeah, you don't want to die on a hill if you know that the battle's lost, sort of thing. So
exactly. But the reverse is also true. If it's close and looks like it's going in our favour, suddenly they'll all pile on as well, like they do with equal marriage.
Yeah, true. Yeah. No, but I was just going back to what I was saying about the constituencies. I just wonder if obviously in our first past the post sort of parliament, we've got constituencies that are very conservative, where maybe the opinion in that constituency might be closer to 50-50, I guess, whereas maybe the national overall opinion on this is like 80%. Perhaps that's the reason at that stage, but presumably that can't be the case for like however many it was at that stage. So yeah, but maybe in a minute we'll come on to where we are now, because we've obviously got something going through now. But I just wanted to ask you where the various parties stand currently in terms of their position, or if they have a position on this now, because I'm sure I read that at least 2 do have a position and are on your side. I didn't know which 2 they were.
Sorry, so the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats.
Okay, they're the 2 that I assumed. Yeah, okay.
They both have policies in support of assisted dying, but also actually the SNP recently put in their manifesto for the last election that they would like to hold a citizens' assembly on assisted dying.
Okay.
Which is really promising. The Conservatives and Labour don't have a policy, but they allow their members a free vote because it's an issue of conscience. So they won't whip their members to vote in a certain way.
Yeah.
Keir Starmer, who's leader of the Labour Party, he's a big supporter.
Yeah. He spoke in favour of the 2015 bill, I think, didn't he?
Because he was director of public prosecutions when the Debbie Purdy case that I mentioned before came. Of course. So yes, so then there are, and now actually in the Conservatives we've got other high-profile individuals who support or who are at least not against, people like Jeremy Hunt.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think we're actually doing, in some respects, we don't want to make it a party political issue because we're doing quite well in both Conservatives and Labour, and as well as the Green Party and the Lib Dems and the SNP, where we've always had consistently high support.
And not Plaid? Plaid aren't. Do you know anything about Plaid?
I don't know officially where they are. I know we've got MPs like Ben Lake, who's supportive.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know across the board where they are.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and obviously you've got clear majority support in the House of Lords.
We do, yes. We there has been a bit of churn, but we certainly had a majority of support during the Faulkner bill, and we don't think that's materially changed. Yeah, and we've also got a small majority of support in Holyrood in Scotland, because it's a devolved issue for Scotland.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Do you know if the Scottish Greens are the same as the England and Wales Greens?
Yes, they do. Well, they are separate, but they do also support assisted dying.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So, yeah. So you have a majority in Holyrood as well. So yeah,
we do. Yeah.
Good. And so earlier you listed quite a few countries. I noted on your website it said that Austria has basically said that they're going to change their law. There were like a handful of others as well. So clearly it's something that a lot of countries are currently looking at. So I guess it could just be that there's just a wave, a global wave on this in the next sort of 10 years. And feels like you know, we're not, it doesn't, for me, we just don't appear to be a country that wants to lead things anymore. We're quite happy to follow these days. But this is clearly something that, if, you know, we're talking 85% of the public, it's a case of the MPs and the politicians catching up, isn't it? As opposed to trying to convince more of the public, which seems to, we're already there really on this.
Absolutely, and I think that's why we really need more people to write to their MP and speak to them about it and say why you support the law, because I think a lot of that 84%, there's a bit of a passive support that we need to galvanize more and have more people coming out and saying they support us, and demonstrating to their politicians that they can feel confident and know there isn't going to be a backlash, and in fact most of their constituents are going to be behind them. You're right that other countries, Spain, have legalized recently.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
Our neighbours in Ireland have a bill at the moment going through the Dáil, which is really exciting. Jersey and the Channel Islands, they've got a citizens jury on assisted dying at the moment. As you say, Austria and Germany have both had court rulings. They haven't quite put in frameworks yet, but they've had, their courts have declared that it is a right.
Yeah.
And so there's a ripple effect happening all over.
Yeah.
And I agree on other areas like abortion or equal marriage, we've always led the way. So it is a real shame that we're not leading the way, but I do hope that we will catch up very soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to ask you to agree with me on this, but I mean, I think if we had a Labour government, we probably would be leading the way in a lot more progressive stuff. But so we've got Baroness Meach's bill, private member's bill in the Lords, that's getting its first reading on Wednesday next week. So how is that different to, well, firstly, well, no, let me ask you it this way. How is it different to Lord Faulkner's in 2014? And if it's not any different, do you view its success or its trajectory as being any different?
It won't be that different. And that's because Faulkner's bill was successful. It did reading. It was really popular. And the Lords added some additional safeguards as well. So having a High Court judge oversee the process, for example, was added in, and that proved very popular.
Yeah.
So
but that was voted through unanimously, I think, wasn't it? I read.
I think so. Yeah.
So yeah.
So we would keep those aspects of the Faulkner bill, I imagine, because they were really popular.
Yeah.
We will obviously take a look and see if there's anything that our colleagues have added in Australia and New Zealand that we think might also bring additional support, if there are any additional safeguards. But fundamentally it won't change, I don't think, materially from the Faulkner bill, because I think that was a success. Unfortunately it ran out of time, and I think this time around the mood in Parliament has really shifted. We've got far more MPs on side. The House of Lords has also, the makeup of the House of Lords has changed a little bit. We've got some more progressive voices coming in as well. People like Ruth Davidson, who's coming to the House of Lords. She's a big supporter.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, and she's got faith as well. So that's also quite promising. So no, I think it will be along broadly similar lines, and I think we're feeling, I don't know, dare I say confident. I don't know if I can.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
hopeful is probably
well, I mean, good, because like for me, so, campaigning in the progressive space, I think us poor progressives these days, we're just battered and bruised. We're just looking for a win anywhere. So if we can get this through, that would be a fantastic achievement, and something we can finally like wave our flag proudly about and be like, hooray, Britain's done something good for a change. So yeah, exactly. I was going to ask you if you feel as though Boris Johnson's 80-seat majority, which is proving very damaging to a lot of progressive causes right now, might prove damaging to progress on this issue.
I don't think it has that much impact, actually, because assisted dying is always a conscience issue. It's a free vote, so there won't be any whipping.
That's
and every MP is an individual who gets to make their own mind up on this.
Yeah.
Which isn't the case on lots of other issues where they're really kind of held in line by the government, and that won't be the case here. So it really is every MP as an individual, which is why we do really rely on supporters getting in touch and contacting their MPs and telling them why it matters. And sometimes I think, people don't always think contacting your MP is the sort of sexy, interesting way of campaigning these days. Lots of people want to be out protesting and do stuff on social media, but it's actually really, really important. It's such a important fabric of our democracy to, if you're feeling angry or frustrated about something, contact your MP. Even if you don't agree with your MP on other issues, they might agree with you on this, or you might be able to influence them and slowly, shift them onto our side. So it is a pure numbers game. Essentially, we need a majority. We need, just over half. We don't have to convince all 650 MPs, but we do need to convince just a small majority of them. Our support in the Conservative Party has gone up a lot. We still have slightly more support in Labour, but actually, I think a point you made earlier, actually, ordinary Conservative voters are in fact quite supportive of us, and we've looked at polling. So, although we have a lot of support from progressives, and I imagine lots of people listening to this podcast, we do also get quite good support across the board from more traditional small c Conservatives, from the kind of red wall area that everyone's talking about at the moment. We get quite support from red wall voters, and we're doing a bit more polling on that as well. So actually, that we're not limited by that at all. It really is an issue that can unite people from all directions.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting, actually. And again, I'm just going to go back to that point I made earlier about it's just so nice to have consensus in these groups, which the last few years have just been at total odds, each other's necks about everything. So maybe this is a nice little place where we can stop and shake hands, in the what was it called, between the trenches, the no man's land. I mean, that's great. That's really pleasing to hear, and I'm glad to hear that Conservatives are supportive of this as well, because obviously most people who vote Conservative tend to be older, and so it's in their interest as well in so many ways, isn't it? Like younger people like myself at the age of 30, it's not on our horizons yet. Obviously, it will be one day. So it makes so much sense for those older people to be thinking about this as well, and I'm glad that they're thinking, in this way, because obviously. And the other thing I was going to mention was we haven't had the results of the census yet, but polling has shown that 50% of the country these days are non-religious. So I guess that dwindling religiosity perhaps has impacted public opinion in favor of this, because presumably a lot of the opposition in other countries on this sort of thing will come from religious lobbying, won't it?
Yes, it will definitely, and I think that will have an impact, like it did with issues like equal marriage, for example.
And abortion.
I think that dwindling religion. But actually, another point we haven't really spoken about is, I think, although you're absolutely right, older people tend to be thinking about this issue a bit more. But I think the pandemic has really thrown up death and dying and made it, something that everyone is more aware of, actually, and made it something. Unfortunately, a lot of younger people have now come into contact with death in their family or in their wider circle, and I think that has made a lot more people actually sit up and think about their own mortality, which, although isn't a very cheery subject, it's actually important that we are thinking about it. So I think that's perhaps engaged people of all ages, maybe even more.
No, that's a really good point. I might just sneak this in just because we've still got a little bit of time left. But do you, as a campaigner, do you find it tricky to campaign on something that's quite sort of, I guess, not macabre, but kind of, it's not the cheeriest of things to, I mean, people who campaign on the climate emergency must also feel a little bit like this at times as well. But do you have to be quite robust sort of emotionally to campaign on this sort of stuff? Because obviously, presumably you're coming into contact with people who are suffering, and obviously some of the people you named earlier, I remember like Terry Pratchett, who I used to love. Terry Pratchett was somebody that you worked with, wasn't he? So is it, do you need to be quite robust to campaign in this space?
Well, I think it's like a lot of issues, really. It's, you know, those stories, although they can often be quite sad and emotional, that really gives you the motivation to want to do something, to want to make the change. It makes you angry and frustrated, and I think that's true of a lot of other issues that you might want to campaign on. You know, they might involve something that's actually quite distressing or bleak, but you're campaigning to try and overturn that, so it doesn't have to happen again. I see that in quite a positive way, and we meet some amazing people, and we're always trying to present our arguments, and, you know, show things in a positive light, because really it's about the vision for the world we want to see.
Of course.
We want society to be, and people are so they're so grateful, and they're so thankful for what we're doing, and we're so grateful to all of their hard work as well. And we do make sure that we support each other. We've got a really good team, and everyone's very supportive of one another, and we all, you know, kind of make sure we take time out if we are dealing with something quite you know, emotional or whatever. We are there for each other, which is great.
Good. So finally, last question. How, obviously, I know you just sort of touched on this a little bit when you said we ought to be emailing our MPs, but how, beyond that, how else can members of the public, perhaps those who are listening to this podcast and are like, yeah, I want to help this, what can we do to help?
Great. There are lots of things you can do. Firstly, I would suggest that you sign up to receive our emails. We tend to send emails out once a week with all the important news, but also, you know, details of things like emailing your MP and what's coming up and so on. So if you go to our website, which is just dignityindying.org.uk, and you can sign up there to our email list. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Dignity in Dying. And that way you'll see, you know, if you can share our content on social media, that's also really appreciated. But even just having conversations with colleagues, friends, family, the more people we can get talking about this and saying how frustrated they are, and again talking to their MPs as well, the more likely and the faster that change will happen.
Brilliant. Francesca, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, James. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you.
And yourself. Yeah, it's been super. What I'll do is I'll make sure that I put all the links when I upload this in the description, so anyone that wants to sign up to the newsletter or who hasn't liked your socials, they can do that quite easily. So I'll do that as well.
Oh, I forgot to say we're on Instagram as well.
Oh, on Instagram. I'll do that as well. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, got to get the youngsters involved as well, for sure. Yeah. Francesca, thank you very much.
But yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.